The first time Gabriella Whitmore heard her father's heart monitor flatline, the world didn't shatter with noise. It cracked in terrifying silence. She stood frozen, her hands clutching the stiff leather of her purse, unable to move, unable to breathe, as nurses flooded into the hospital room. Somewhere through the haze, she heard a voice shouting for a crash cart. Another calling her name, but Gabriella's feet refused to obey. All she could do was watch as the last piece of her steady, secure life slipped through trembling fingers. Her father, Judge Robert Whitmore, wasn't supposed to be fragile. He was a pillar, stoic, stubborn, larger than life in the courts of Savannah, Georgia. Yet here he lay, small and still beneath white sheets, a man crushed by the quiet weight of stress and betrayal that no one had seen coming. The flat line ended, the monitor beeping again, thin and broken. Relief punched the breath from her lungs, but the doctors' faces were grave. Temporary. Fragile. The damage was done. Hours later, the fluorescent buzz of the hospital corridors filled the hollow spaces inside Gabriella's chest. She sat numbly in a cracked vinyl chair outside the ICU, the weight of decisions pressing against her shoulders. Treatment options were presented clinically. Experimental surgery, astronomical costs. No guarantees. No insurance company would cover it. And even with every asset she owned, her event planning firm, her savings, her car, it wouldn't be enough. Not even close. Gabriella wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her blazer, forcing herself upright. Whitmore's didn't crumble in public. That's what her father had taught her. Appearances mattered, especially in Savannah, where lineage and reputation carried as much weight as bank accounts. But appearances couldn't pay an $800,000 medical bill. Her phone buzzed sharply against the chair beside her. She snatched it up, hoping for an update. Anything. Instead, a simple text blinked back at her. Matthew Sinclair requests your presence. Tomorrow. Noon. Sinclair Estate. Gabriella stared at the message, heart thudding unevenly. Matthew Sinclair. Savannah's untouchable tech magnate. Wealthy beyond comprehension, cold beyond rumor. He didn't request meetings, he summoned. She had never crossed paths with him directly, not in the rarefied air of society galas where he rarely attended, not in charity auctions where his donations arrived anonymously. He existed like a myth, calculated, remote, devastatingly brilliant, and by all accounts, completely heartless. Why her? Why now? She gripped the phone until her knuckles whitened. Part of her screamed to ignore it. She didn't make deals with men like Matthew Sinclair. But another quieter voice, the one molded by hospital bills and sleepless nights, whispered, "What choice do you have? If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thought mattered to me either way." The next day, Savannah's sun beat heavy and golden against the cobbled streets as Gabriella's rideshare wound through the historic district. Spanish moss draped the ancient oaks overhead, like ghostly reminders of a time when fortunes were made, or lost, overnight. The Sinclair estate loomed at the end of a private drive, a sprawling, white-columned Georgian mansion, flawless, imposing, untouchable. Gabriella smoothed her simple navy dress, checking the tremble in her hands before she stepped out. No fear, no weakness. You're a Whitmore, she told herself. The massive iron doors opened before she could knock. Celia Vance, Sinclair's personal assistant, waited, perfectly composed in tailored gray. "Ms. Whitmore." Celia's smile was polite but cool. "Mr. Sinclair is expecting you." "Follow me." Inside, the estate gleamed with polished floors and glinting chandeliers. Art lined the walls, No garish displays of wealth, only quiet, devastating taste. Every step Gabriella took echoed louder in the vast, pristine halls. The study door stood ajar. Beyond it, Matthew Sinclair rose from behind an enormous mahogany desk, the afternoon light carving sharp planes across his features. He was unnervingly beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with softness. Dark hair, slightly tousled like he'd run a hand through it in irritation. Crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to hint at strength, not affectation. And eyes, cold, assessing, a shade of stormy blue that made Gabriella's spine stiffen instinctively. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, voice smooth as polished steel. "Thank you for coming." He gestured to a chair opposite his. Gabriella sat cautiously, every muscle taut. "I imagine you're wondering why you're here," Matthew said, studying her the way one might examine a particularly interesting chess piece. "That would be a fair assumption," she replied, lifting her chin slightly. A flicker of amusement, so brief she might have imagined it, crossed his face. "I'll be direct. You need financial assistance." "I need a wife." Gabriella blinked, momentarily convinced she had misheard. "Excuse me?" Matthew steepled his fingers. "In approximately 3 months, Sinclair Innovations will finalize a merger with an international firm. Their board requires partners to be grounded, stable, married, preferably. It aligns with their values." Her stomach turned. "And you think I would—" "I've researched you," he said, tone calm and undeniable. "Intelligent? Independent. No scandal. No entanglements." Gabriella's cheeks burned. He had researched her like she was a background check. "In return, your father's treatment is fully covered. No conditions. No repayment." He slid a file across the desk. "It's all outlined here. A 1-year agreement. Divorce after that, if you wish. Assets cleanly separated. No interference in your personal ventures." Gabriella's fingers itched to shred the papers without reading them. How dare he reduce marriage to a contract? To a business deal? "How generous," she said coolly, voice like cut glass. Matthew's gaze didn't waver. "Generosity has nothing to do with it. Efficiency does." The silence stretched, thick with the weight of things left unsaid. Her father, his legacy, her inability to save him on her own. Gabriella stood abruptly, her chair scraping faintly against the floor. "I'll think about it," she said, forcing evenness into her tone. Matthew inclined his head, as if he already knew she would return. As Celia led her out, Gabriella's mind raced. The offer was outrageous, indecent, insulting. It was also brutally her only option. She reached the heavy iron doors, paused, and looked back. Matthew Sinclair watched her from the shadows of the study, unreadable. Gabriella's heart twisted painfully. A cold, calculated man was offering her the means to save the person she loved most in this world. All he wanted in exchange was her life. Tomorrow she would have to decide, her freedom or her father's future, and either choice would cost her far more than she was ready to admit. Gabriella stared at the contract on her kitchen table as if it might lunge at her. The morning light streamed through the cracked blinds of her tiny loft, catching the gold lettering of Sinclair Innovations at the top of the page. No matter how many times she reread it, the offer remained the same. Marriage, 1 year, no emotional attachments, no strings except the invisible ones that would tie her life irrevocably to Matthew Sinclair. Her stomach churned. The clock ticked loudly in the silence, each second slicing deeper into her resolve. If she didn't act, her father's chance at recovery would slip away. time, merciless and unfeeling, wasn't going to wait for her pride to catch up. If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thought mattered to me either way. Her phone buzzed. Sophie Caldwell, coffee. Now, no excuses. Gabriella exhaled shakily, grabbed the contract, and headed out. The downtown cafe buzzed with late-morning chatter, the comforting clatter of mugs and spoons grounding her in a reality that had nothing to do with billionaires and impossible decisions. Sophie spotted her instantly, waving with the energy of someone who had already had 2 espressos. "Sit," Sophie ordered, sliding a caramel latte across the table. "And don't even think about lying to me. You've got that someone offered me a deal with the devil look." Gabriella dropped into the chair, the contract landing between them with a soft thud. Sophie's eyebrows climbed her forehead. Well, well. She leaned in, skimming the top page. "You weren't kidding." "I don't know what to do." Gabriella's voice cracked despite her best effort. "It's monstrous." Sophie tilted her head thoughtfully. "Is it monstrous if it saves your dad?" Gabriella's throat tightened. "He's offering you a lifeline," Sophie said gently. "In his own frosty, emotionless way, sure, but still, a lifeline." Gabriella twisted the paper napkin in her lap. "But at what cost?" "My independence, my sanity." Sophie gave her a long, assessing look. "Gabs, you've been carrying the world alone for years. Maybe it's not weakness to let someone help, even if he is basically a cyborg in a tailored suit." A laugh bubbled up, raw, unsteady, but it eased some of the crushing weight in her chest. Sophie reached over, squeezing Gabriella's hand. "Whatever you choose, I'm with you. But if you say yes, go in with your eyes wide open. Sinclair doesn't do anything without an angle." Gabriella nodded, the knot in her stomach hardening into something dangerously close to resolve. She returned to the loft, the afternoon heat pressing against the windows, the city humming below. She sat at the table again, picked up the pen resting atop the contract. This wasn't about her pride anymore. It wasn't about appearances. It was about her father, about giving him a chance at a life he had earned 1,000 times over. Her hand trembled once, then steadied. She signed. The moment the ink dried, her phone buzzed again. "Celia Vance. Car will collect you at 4 p.m. Attire, professional." Gabriella stared at the screen, the finality of it hitting her like a slow-moving wave. There would be no grand wedding, no sweeping romance, just a transaction, cold and efficient. At precisely 4 p.m., a sleek black town car pulled up outside her building. The driver, a stone-faced man in a crisp uniform, opened the door without a word. The Sinclair estate loomed even larger now, bathed in the mellow light of late afternoon. Gabriella was led not to the study this time, but to a smaller room paneled in dark oak, the faint scent of old books and lemon polish filling the air. Matthew stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the setting sun. He didn't turn when she entered, giving her a strange sense of stepping into someone's private, unguarded moment. "You signed?" he said simply. Gabriella's voice was steady. "I did." He turned then, studying her the way a jeweler might study a flawed diamond, intensely, critically, searching for cracks. "There's a judge waiting downstairs." His tone was cool, impersonal. "The marriage will be legal immediately." Gabriella nodded, swallowing past the lump in her throat. Matthew crossed the room, stopping a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension stretched taut between them, heavy with everything that would never be said. "You're certain?" he asked, voice softer, almost reluctant. Gabriella lifted her chin. "Are you?" Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. Regret? Pity? Hope? "Certainty is a luxury," he said finally. "Efficiency is a necessity." The words felt like a slap, even though she knew he hadn't meant them cruelly. She bit the inside of her cheek, refusing to let emotion show. "Then let's be efficient," she said, her voice cool as marble. The ceremony was conducted in the mansion's library, beneath the vaulted ceiling and towering shelves. The judge, a small, wiry man with kind eyes, led them through the brief proceedings. Gabriella barely heard the words. Her heart pounded, her vision tunneled. When the judge asked if she took this man, she answered automatically, her voice a whisper of sound. Matthew's hand was steady as he slipped the simple platinum band onto her finger. No tremor. No hesitation. When it was done, the judge smiled kindly, offering a few words of congratulations neither of them really heard. Celia appeared at Gabriella's elbow almost instantly. "This way, Mrs. Sinclair. Mrs. Sinclair." The name felt alien in her mouth, heavy on her shoulders. She followed Celia through winding corridors until they reached a massive, gleaming elevator. Inside, Gabriella risked a glance at Matthew. He stood stiffly, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed on the glowing floor numbers. Trapped, she realized. He looked as trapped as she felt. The elevator opened into a penthouse suite unlike anything Gabriella had ever imagined. Modern, sleek, terrifyingly impersonal. All glass and chrome, not a single photograph, not a trace of warmth. "This is your home now," Matthew said quietly, stepping inside. Gabriella didn't move. Matthew turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "This is temporary," he said. "A year. You're free to live your life." "I won't interfere." She wanted to scream, to shake him, to demand he admit that marriage meant more than contracts and convenience. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you." The words tasted bitter, hollow. Matthew's gaze dropped to her hand, the one now wearing his ring, and for a heartbeat, something human flickered in his eyes, a longing he quickly smothered. "Dinner is at 8, he said stiffly. "You're free until then." He left her standing there, alone in a palace of empty promises. Gabriella pressed her back against the cold elevator wall, her heart pounding in her ears. She was Mrs. Matthew Sinclair, and she had never felt more alone in her life. Gabriella stood in the center of the penthouse, the silence pressing against her like a second skin. Every step echoed. Every breath seemed too loud for a space so vast and sterile. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the savannah skyline in glittering lights, but the view felt more like a painting hung in a museum than a life she belonged to. Dinner was in less than an hour. She wandered through the cavernous space, trailing her fingers along the back of an immaculate leather sofa. Not a speck of dust. Not a misplaced book. The place was flawless and entirely soulless. In the guest wing, a room had been prepared for her. Gabriella stepped inside, taking in the neutral decor, the heavy drapes, the impersonal perfection. A note lay on the bed, penned in the same precise handwriting she'd seen on the contract. Wardrobe provided. "Choose whatever makes you most comfortable." Monsieur Gabriella opened the massive walk-in closet, blinking at the sight. Row after row of designer dresses, casual wear, shoes. Each piece her size, her style, but elevated, polished. She picked a simple black dress, classic but elegant, and changed quickly, trying not to think about how much thought, or calculation, had gone into preparing it all. At precisely 8 o'clock, she found her way to the formal dining room. The table was long enough to seat 20. Tonight it held only 2 place settings at one end, a single candle flickering between them. Matthew stood by the window, sipping from a crystal tumbler. He turned at the sound of her heels, his gaze skimming over her with a flash of something she couldn't quite name. "You look appropriate," he said. Gabriella arched an eyebrow. "High praise from a man who arranged my closet." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile, but he masked it before it could fully form. "I prefer efficiency," Matthew said, moving to pull out her chair. "Less margin for error." Gabriella sat stiffly, murmuring a polite thank you. A server, silent, professional, appeared with plates of seared salmon, asparagus, and wild rice. They ate in near silence for several minutes, the clink of silverware unnervingly loud in the vast room. Finally, Gabriella set down her fork, meeting his gaze head-on. "Why me?" Matthew didn't pretend to misunderstand. "You're suitable." The bluntness hit harder than it should have. "I'm not a business acquisition," she said, voice tight. "No." His gaze sharpened, pinning her in place. "You're a solution. Temporary, mutually beneficial. And," he added, "you needed me." The words landed between them like a slap neither of them dared acknowledge. Gabriella pushed her plate away, appetite gone. "I wonder," she said softly, almost to herself, "if you even know how to be human anymore." A heavy pause filled the space between them. Matthew leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. Emotions complicate things. "They also make things worth having," she countered, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. For a flickering second, something raw, something startlingly vulnerable, crossed his face. "You're confusing sentiment with value," he said finally, quieter now. "They're not the same." Gabriella wanted to argue, to shake him, to demand he see the world the way she did. But what would be the point? This man didn't believe in hearts, only transactions. The meal ended with polite, hollow conversation about logistical matters, upcoming events they needed to attend together, expectations in public, guidelines for maintaining the illusion of a perfect marriage. When the plates were cleared, Matthew rose. "I assume you prefer privacy," he said. Gabriella nodded. "I'll have the East Wing arranged exclusively for you." There it was again. The distance. The invisible wall he kept reinforced between them at all times. "Thank you," she said, and hated how small the words sounded. Matthew hesitated. For the first time since she met him, he looked unsure. "If there's anything you need," he said, voice low, "you need only ask." Gabriella forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And if what I need is you to act like a real husband?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Raw. Reckless. Matthew froze. For a moment, just one heartbeat of unbearable tension. She thought he might close the distance between them. Say something real. Do something unexpected. Instead, he drew in a slow, controlled breath. "I don't offer what I cannot guarantee," he said quietly. And just like that, the chasm between them widened. Gabriella nodded stiffly, excused herself, and fled to the sanctuary of the East Wing. She didn't cry. She refused to cry over a man who had made it clear that warmth, connection, love, those were luxuries he neither wanted nor believed in. Still, as she stood by the enormous window overlooking the river, watching the lights ripple across the dark water, an ache bloomed deep in her chest. She was living in a gilded cage, wearing his ring, sharing his name. And somehow, she had never felt more invisible. Behind her, the distant sound of the elevator signaled Matthew's departure. Business meeting, probably. Another deal. Another empire to build. Gabriella pressed her forehead to the cool glass. 1 year, she whispered to herself. Just survive 1 year. But even as she said it, she knew. Survival would be the easy part. It was her heart that would be the real battlefield. Gabriella adjusted the slim bracelet on her wrist, staring at her reflection in the full-length mirror. The dress she wore, a deep emerald silk that skimmed her curves, had been chosen carefully from the curated wardrobe Matthew's assistant provided. Elegant. Sophisticated. Precisely the kind of image the new Mrs. Sinclair was expected to project at Savannah's most prestigious charity gala tonight. But no matter how perfectly the fabric clung or how artfully her hair had been pinned, Gabriella felt like an imposter, a stranger trying to fit into a life that had never been meant for her. A soft knock sounded at the door. "Mrs. Sinclair?" Celia's voice was cool and professional. Gabriella smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her skirt before opening the door. Celia, impeccable in a navy-sheath dress, offered a thin smile. "Mr. Sinclair is waiting downstairs." "The car is ready." Gabriella nodded, forcing her nerves into submission. Tonight would be the first time they appeared together publicly, the first time the society pages would splash their names side by side. The first real test of their carefully constructed facade. As she descended the grand staircase, her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. Matthew stood at the base, immaculate in a tailored black tuxedo, adjusting the cufflinks on his wrists. He looked up as she approached, his gaze skimming over her with a flash of something that made her breath hitch. Approval, admiration, or simply calculation. "You look acceptable," he said, offering his arm. Gabriella bit back a retort and placed her hand lightly on his sleeve. The fabric was cool beneath her fingers like the man himself. The ride to the gala passed in a blur of city lights and strained silence. Gabriella watched Matthew from the corner of her eye, searching for cracks in the armor. But he remained maddeningly unreadable, his posture relaxed, his expression distant. "You'll be expected to mingle," he said without looking at her. "Smile. Appear happy." "I know how to play my part," she said, a touch of steel in her voice. He finally glanced at her then, and for a moment, his mouth curved. Not quite a smile, but something close. "I never doubted it," he said quietly. The gala was held in one of Savannah's grandest historic mansions, its sweeping ballrooms filled with the glittering elite. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the crowd, the scent of jasmine and champagne thick in the air. As they entered, conversations faltered. Heads turned. Cameras flashed. Gabriella pasted a serene smile on her face, clinging to Matthew's arm like a lifeline. She felt every gaze like a weight pressing against her skin. "Matthew Sinclair, and this must be your new bride." An older woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper smile materialized from the crowd, extending a manicured hand. "Mrs. Langston," Matthew said smoothly, shaking her hand. "A pleasure." "And such a pleasure to meet you, dear, Mrs." Langston cooed, turning to Gabriella with predatory interest. "We were beginning to think Matthew would die a confirmed bachelor." Gabriella laughed softly, the sound practiced but warm. "I suppose he simply needed the right motivation." "Mrs." Langston's eyes twinkled with unspoken speculation, but she patted Gabriella's hand approvingly before being swept away by another socialite. Gabriella exhaled slowly. "You're doing well," Matthew murmured, his lips barely moving. "Was there ever any doubt?" she replied under her breath. He chuckled, a low, surprising sound that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. For the next hour, They danced the intricate ballet of Savannah's high society. Introductions, compliments, carefully constructed conversations. Gabriella played her role flawlessly, drawing laughter and admiration without revealing anything truly real. It was exhausting. At one point, as she accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server, she felt Matthew's hand press lightly against the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd. The touch was brief, almost clinical, but it sent a jolt of awareness through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "You're popular tonight," he said, his tone unreadable. "Am I making you jealous, mister?" "Sinclair?" she teased lightly, surprised at her own boldness. His gaze locked with hers, dark and inscrutable. "Jealousy is a waste of energy," he said. "I prefer control." Gabriella's smile faltered. "Control," she echoed softly. "Right. Of course." Before either could say more, a new figure approached. Tall, golden-haired, with a gleaming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Landon Carr," he said, extending a hand to Gabriella. "We haven't had the pleasure." Gabriella shook his hand, feeling an undercurrent of something sharp beneath his charming exterior. "Gabriella Sinclair," she replied smoothly. Landon's gaze flicked to Matthew, a glint of rivalry unmistakable. "Congratulations," Landon said, the word laced with something just a little too sharp. "Didn't think I'd ever see the day Sinclair settled down." "Life is full of surprises," Matthew said coolly. Landon chuckled. "Indeed." He turned back to Gabriella, his smile sharpening. "If you ever tire of the Iceman, Mrs. Sinclair, I'm always available for a little Southern hospitality." The remark was casual enough to pass in polite company, but Gabriella felt the deliberate provocation beneath it. Before she could respond, Matthew stepped slightly closer, his hand once again resting lightly but possessively at her back. "Mrs. Sinclair has impeccable taste," he said, voice mild but carrying an unmistakable warning. "I'm sure she won't be seeking alternatives." For the first time, Landon's smile slipped, only for a second. Then he laughed, offered a mock bow, and disappeared into the crowd. Gabriella glanced up at Matthew, her heart racing. "Was that necessary?" she whispered. He didn't look at her, scanning the room with a detached gaze. "Perception is everything." "I can handle myself," she said. His mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "I know." The words should have been reassuring. Instead, they left her feeling even more like a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand. The evening dragged on, a blur of forced smiles and strategic small talk. When they finally slipped away, Gabriella sagged against the leather seat of the town car, exhaustion seeping into her bones. "You were impressive tonight," Matthew said after a long stretch of silence. Gabriella turned her head to look at him, searching for any sign of genuine emotion behind the mask he wore so effortlessly. "Thank you," she said, because anything more would have cracked something fragile inside her. He looked away, his profile etched against the city lights, so beautiful and distant that it made her chest ache. For one brief, reckless moment, Gabriella wondered what it would take to break through that careful armor, and whether it was worth the risk of breaking herself in the process. The next morning, Gabriella stood in the East Wing sunroom, coffee cup cradled in her hands, staring out at the mist rolling off the river. The estate grounds stretched endlessly, immaculate gardens and ancient oaks dripping with Spanish moss. It was breathtaking and suffocating all at once. Behind her, the faint sound of polished shoes on marble echoed closer. "You're up early," Matthew's voice came low and smooth. Gabriella didn't turn. "Old habit?" I used to have morning meetings, stacked from 7 to noon. Coffee and adrenaline kept me alive. She heard him approach but kept her gaze on the horizon. I didn't mean to wake you, he said, his voice closer now, almost gentle. You didn't. She finally faced him, coffee shielding her like armor. I don't sleep well these days. Matthew studied her for a moment, that unreadable expression firmly in place. He wore a dark sweater and slacks, casual, almost approachable, if not for the impenetrable wall he carried everywhere he went. I have meetings downtown today, he said, sliding his hands into his pockets. You're welcome to come. Or not. It's up to you. Gabriella tilted her head slightly. An invitation or an obligation? Would it be expected? She asked carefully. A flicker of something crossed his face. Frustration, maybe. Or regret. It would help the illusion, he admitted. The illusion. Right. She gave a tight smile. Then I'll come. Matthew nodded once, brisk, businesslike. But as he turned away, Gabriella caught the faintest hesitation in his step, as if he wanted to say something more. He didn't. 2 hours later, they sat side by side in the back of the black town car, gliding past the moss-draped streets of downtown Savannah. The silence between them was almost comforting now. At least Gabriella knew how to wear it like a second skin. At the Sinclair Innovations headquarters, a towering glass building overlooking the river, Matthew transformed. The moment he stepped out of the car, he became the man the world feared and respected. Precise, commanding, untouchable. Celia met them in the lobby, tablet in hand, rattling off schedules and meetings. Gabriella trailed a step behind, feeling every pair of eyes in the lobby tracking their progress. Whispers floated through the air. That's his wife? Didn't even know he was seeing someone. She must be something special to lock down Sinclair. Gabriella kept her chin high, her smile serene, even as unease twisted in her gut. The boardroom was sleek and cold, a long obsidian table surrounded by Savannah's most ruthless businessmen and women. Matthew took his place at the head, Gabriella at his right hand, playing her part with polite silence. She watched him work, his clipped words, his sharp mind cutting through negotiations like a blade. He was brilliant, undeniable, and completely alone, even in a room full of people. At one point, Matthew glanced sideways at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes when he caught her watching. Gabriella offered a small, knowing smile. Nothing theatrical, just enough to say, I see you. For the first time since she had met him, Matthew's mask slipped, just a little. His mouth softened at the corners, almost imperceptibly. No one else noticed. But she did. After the meeting, while Matthew fielded a phone call, Gabriella wandered onto the terrace overlooking the river. The cool breeze was a balm against the tension gripping her shoulders. Quite a show in there, a smooth voice drawled behind her. Gabriella turned to find Landon Carr leaning casually against the railing, his smile all polished charm. I don't believe we've been properly introduced, he said, offering his hand again. Gabriella shook it briefly. We met at the gala. Ah, but that was amidst so much noise, Landon said, flashing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Here, it's just us. She arched a brow. Careful, you'll give the wrong impression. Landon chuckled. I'm not the one flaunting a marriage of convenience, Mrs. Sinclair. The smile froze on Gabriella's lips. Landon leaned in slightly, dropping his voice. People talk, you know. Fast wedding, no family, no engagement party. It doesn't exactly scream true love. Gabriella met his gaze coolly. And yet, here I am. Landon laughed, straightening. Touché. Just be careful. Matthew Sinclair doesn't do anything without a reason. I'll keep that in mind, she said evenly. Matthew appeared at that moment, his presence cutting through the tension like a razor. Is there a problem? He asked, voice deceptively calm. Not at all, Landon said smoothly. Just welcoming your lovely wife to the jungle. Matthew's eyes narrowed slightly. Your concern is noted. Landon tipped an imaginary hat, then sauntered back inside. Gabriella let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Matthew turned to her, his gaze sharper now. Protective. Don't trust him, he said. I don't trust many people, she replied quietly. Something shifted between them, something unspoken, heavy with things neither dared to name. Come, Matthew said after a moment. There's someone I want you to meet. They crossed the terrace to a smaller conference room where an elegant, silver-haired woman waited. She rose as they entered, her eyes bright and assessing. Mrs. Beatrice Sinclair, Matthew said. My grandmother. Gabriella blinked, startled. She hadn't expected family. Not here. Not him. Mrs. Sinclair offered a hand, her grip firm and warm. Welcome to the family, my dear. Gabriella smiled, genuinely this time. Thank you, it's an honor. Mrs. Sinclair studied her for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. Strength, she said to Matthew, as if he had passed some secret test. She has it. Matthew's mouth tightened, almost as if he were battling emotion. He simply inclined his head. Gabriella sensed there was more history here, deep currents she couldn't yet see. But for the first time since signing that contract, she felt something real stir between them. Hope, fragile, dangerous. Real. Later, as they drove home in silence, Gabriella dared a glance at Matthew. He stared out the window, but his hand rested lightly on the space between them, open, almost reaching. She didn't take it, not yet, but for the first time she wondered if, maybe, he wasn't as unreachable as she had thought. Gabriella wandered through the Sinclair estate later that evening, restless energy burning under her skin. Dinner had been a quiet affair, more silence than conversation, more stolen glances than actual connection. Matthew had retreated to his office almost immediately afterward, citing work. And she was left adrift in a palace too large, too empty to feel anything like home. She found herself drawn toward the West Wing, a part of the estate she hadn't yet explored. No one had forbidden it, but somehow it felt like forbidden ground all the same. The hallway was different here, warmer. The walls weren't stark and lifeless, but lined with old photographs, family portraits framed in rich oak. Matthew as a child, smiling, really smiling, at a birthday party. Matthew as a young man, standing proudly beside his father, both of them looking stiff but proud in front of a gleaming new building, with Sinclair Innovations etched into the stone. Gabriella's steps slowed. She reached out, fingertips brushing lightly against the glass of one frame. A boy with a future mapped out before he could even dream one of his own. She was still standing there when a low voice broke the quiet. You shouldn't be here. Gabriella turned to find Matthew leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't angry, yet there was something guarded in his eyes, something brittle. I didn't realize it was off limits, she said evenly, refusing to be embarrassed. He pushed away from the door, walking slowly toward her. It's not, he said after a pause. It's just not for show. Gabriella searched his face. You keep the past hidden? His mouth curved, not a smile, not even close, but something sadder. Some things are easier to leave in the dark. She turned back to the photo of him as a boy, full of life and promise. "You were happy once," she said softly. Matthew said nothing for a long moment. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. A long time ago. Gabriella's heart twisted. She wanted to reach for him, to bridge the gap between the man he had been and the one standing before her now. But she stayed where she was, sensing instinctively that pushing would only make him retreat further. Instead, she asked, "What happened?" Matthew's eyes darkened, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. "My father built this empire," he said finally, voice low. He expected perfection, achievement, no room for mistakes. Love was conditional. Gabriella swallowed, the pieces clicking painfully into place. "So you stopped trying to earn it," she guessed. He gave a hollow laugh. "You learn eventually that some debts can never be paid." A heavy silence fell between them, weighted with all the things he wasn't saying. Gabriella felt it pressing against her chest, an ache that wasn't entirely hers to bear, but somehow settled there anyway. "I'm not asking for perfection, Matthew," she said quietly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a heartbeat, the walls between them cracked. "You should," he said, voice rough. "It would make this easier." Before she could respond, he turned abruptly and strode down the hall, disappearing into the shadows. Gabriella stood there for a long moment, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs. This was their marriage, a series of almosts and nevers, a dance around truths too raw to name. But for the first time, she saw the man beneath the armor. And she wasn't sure whether that made her stronger or dangerously close to breaking. The next few days blurred into a strange rhythm. They attended charity functions, business dinners, press interviews. Always the perfect couple, smiling for the cameras, dancing the waltz of public affection. But behind closed doors, the distance remained. Sometimes Gabriella caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. A flicker of something in his gaze, something she didn't dare hope for. One evening, after a particularly grueling gala, Gabriella kicked off her heels in the foyer and leaned against the wall, eyes closed. "Rough night?" Matthew's voice came from behind her. She laughed softly without opening her eyes. "You try smiling at people who hate you for 3 straight hours and tell me how you feel." He stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat of him at her back. "They don't hate you," he said, voice low. She opened her eyes, turning to find him mere inches away. "They envy you," he continued. "You shine, Gabriella. And they hate anything they can't touch." The words, so unexpected, hit her harder than any insult ever could. "That's dangerously close to a compliment," she said, forcing a lightness she didn't feel. His mouth curved, a slow, reluctant smile that made her chest ache. "Don't get used to it," he murmured. Something crackled between them, electric and undeniable. For one breathless moment she thought he might reach for her, might close the gap that had yawned so painfully wide between them from the start. But then he stepped back, the shutters slamming down over his face. "Good night, Gabriella," he said, voice cool once more. And he was gone, leaving her alone in the cavernous foyer, with nothing but the echo of what almost was. Gabriella pressed a trembling hand to her chest, struggling to steady her breathing. This marriage was supposed to be a transaction. Clean, simple. But there was nothing clean or simple about the way Matthew Sinclair was beginning to unravel her. And she was starting to fear that, no matter how tightly she clung to logic, her heart had already begun the betrayal. The sharp click of Gabriella's heels echoed through the marbled halls of Sinclair Innovations as she followed Celia toward the grand ballroom. The charity auction tonight wasn't just another event. It was a battlefield. Matthew's competitors, allies, enemies pretending to be friends, all packed into one gilded room under the guise of generosity. And tonight Gabriella wasn't just a trophy wife in a designer dress. She was a weapon. The moment they stepped inside, she felt the shift. Conversations paused. Eyes flicked their way. Whispers stirred like a restless wind. Matthew caught sight of her from across the room, his gaze locked onto hers, sharp, unreadable, but something in his stance changed. A subtle straightening, a tension she hadn't seen before. He looked cautious. Gabriella let the corner of her mouth lift into a slow, deliberate smile. Let them watch. Let them wonder. She crossed the room toward him, unhurried, every inch the woman they thought she was, powerful, poised, untouchable. "You're late," Matthew murmured when she reached him, but his voice held no heat. "I like making an entrance," she said lightly, brushing a kiss against his cheek that lingered just a second too long. Matthew's hand found the small of her back, firm and possessive. "You'll cause a scandal," he murmured against her ear. "Good," she whispered back. "Maybe it'll keep them too busy to plot." He pulled back slightly, his mouth curving. Not a smile, but something dangerously close. "You surprise me," he said, his voice so low only she could hear. "You shouldn't," she replied, lifting her chin. "You married me, remember?" Before he could respond, Landon Carr materialized from the crowd, a predatory smile slicing across his face. "Mr. Sinclair, Mrs. Sinclair." His voice dripped fake warmth. "Enjoying the festivities?" Gabriella stiffened slightly, but Matthew's hand remained steady at her back, grounding her. "Immensely," Matthew said smoothly. "And yourself?" "Oh, always," Landon said, flashing teeth. "Though I have to admit, the entertainment tonight is particularly fascinating." His gaze slid to Gabriella, lingering just a fraction too long. Gabriella met his stare head-on, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "Careful, Mr. Carr. Staring at another man's wife could be considered poor manners." Several heads turned at her words. A ripple of amused shock moved through the nearby guests. Matthew's mouth twitched. Landon's smile faltered. "Touche?" Gabriella thought fiercely. "You'll fit in just fine," Landon said after a beat, his tone now edged with something sharper. He lifted his glass in mock salute and disappeared back into the crowd. Gabriella exhaled slowly, tension bleeding from her shoulders. Matthew's hand lingered longer than necessary before he finally dropped it. "You handled him well," he said, sounding almost impressed. "I'm not just here to wear a pretty dress," she replied. Matthew's gaze flickered with something she couldn't quite read. "No," he said. "You're not." The auction began, the chatter fading into the practiced cadence of the auctioneer's voice. Priceless paintings, private yachts, weekend retreats in Napa, all sold off to the highest bidder with barely a flicker of emotion. Gabriella sipped her champagne, letting the buzz of conversation wash over her. She could feel Matthew beside her, a steady presence, and it both comforted and unsettled her. Halfway through the night, as another painting was unveiled, Matthew leaned closer. "After tonight," he said, voice low, "people will stop questioning us." Gabriella turned her head slightly, their faces only inches apart. "Was that the goal all along?" she asked softly. "To make this marriage look real enough that they forget it isn't?" His eyes searched hers, the facade slipping for just a moment. "I didn't expect you to make it so." Convincing, he admitted. Gabriella's heart stumbled in her chest. Before she could respond, a flashbulb went off nearby. A photographer capturing their intimate pose, their unspoken conversation. Matthew straightened immediately, the mask sliding back into place. "Come," he said. "We should be seen." The rest of the night blurred, 1,000 handshakes, 100 brittle smiles. Gabriella played her part to perfection, but her mind kept circling back to those fleeting moments when Matthew's guard had lowered, when he had looked at her like she was more than a solution, more than a shield. Like she was real. As the auction wound down, Matthew led her to the balcony for a breath of fresh air. The night was cool, the river glittering under the moonlight. They stood in silence for a moment, the city stretching out before them. "You did well tonight," Matthew said finally. "So did you," she replied, voice softer than she intended. He turned to her then, really turned, and for the first time, Gabriella saw the weariness etched into his features, the cracks in the perfect facade. "Sometimes I forget what it's like," he said quietly. "To have someone stand beside me, instead of waiting for me to fail." Gabriella's breath caught. "You're not alone, Matthew," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He stared at her, something raw flickering in his eyes. For one charged moment, it felt as if the distance between them might finally break. But then a voice called from inside, summoning them back to the bright lights and sharp smiles. Matthew straightened, the shutters slamming closed once more. "Come," he said, offering his arm. Gabriella hesitated for a fraction of a second before slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow. And as they walked back into the ballroom, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't pretending anymore, and if she wasn't careful, she was going to lose much more than her heart. Rain tapped against the massive windows of the penthouse, soft and steady, like the ticking of a clock Gabriella could never silence. She stood barefoot in the living room, staring at the storm outside, the hem of her silk robe brushing against her ankles. The city lights blurred into smudges of gold and red through the rain, a painting she could never quite touch. A life just out of reach. Behind her she heard the elevator chime, followed by the muted footsteps she could now recognize without looking. Matthew. She didn't turn. Not yet. "You're late," she said, her voice calm, even. "I had meetings," he replied, his tone clipped, almost defensive. Gabriella closed her eyes briefly. Every conversation with him lately felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon she couldn't see the bottom of. "You missed dinner." A pause. She heard the rustle of him removing his jacket, the metallic clink of cufflinks landing on the marble counter. "I didn't realize we were pretending this was a real marriage," Matthew said, quieter now, almost wounded. Gabriella turned slowly, the anger and sadness swirling inside her too sharp to contain. "I wasn't asking for candlelight and roses, Matthew," she said, taking a step closer. "I was asking for 5 minutes of your time. For something real." He stared at her, jaw tight, eyes shadowed. Rain streaked the windows behind him, making him look almost ghostly. A man trapped between what he had built and what he was too afraid to want. "You knew what this was," he said, the words low and deliberate. "You agreed." "I agreed to save my father," she shot back. "I didn't agree to vanish. To become invisible in a house full of empty rooms." Matthew flinched, so subtly most people would have missed it. But Gabriella wasn't most people. She crossed her arms, fighting the sting behind her eyes. "Is this what you wanted? A wife you didn't have to see? Didn't have to feel anything for? His mouth opened, then closed again, as if the words caught in his throat. "I'm not good at this," he said finally, voice rough. "At what?" she demanded. "At being human?" Matthew's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He took a breath, slow and shaky. "I built my life on control, Gabriella," he said. "Every deal, every merger, every step. Calculated. Safe. Love doesn't fit into that." Gabriella's heart cracked, clean and sharp. "And you think it's safer to push everyone away? To live half a life just so you never risk losing anything?" His eyes met hers then, stark and naked for once. "I already lost everything that mattered once," he said, barely above a whisper. "I'm not strong enough to survive it again." The confession hit her harder than any shout, any anger. Gabriella softened, stepping closer until only a breath of air separated them. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "You're stronger than you think. But you're also human, Matthew, and you're going to lose everything again. Not because you aren't good enough, but because you're too scared to try." He closed his eyes, a muscle working in his jaw. "Don't," he rasped. "Don't make this harder." Gabriella lifted her hand slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wanted to. He didn't. She placed her palm flat against his chest, feeling the rapid thud of his heart beneath her fingertips. "You don't have to do this alone," she whispered. For a moment, he stood frozen, as if her touch burned through every layer of armor he had built. Then, with a shuddering breath, he placed his hand over hers, trapping it against his chest. It wasn't an embrace. It wasn't a surrender. But it was a beginning. The air between them crackled, thick with everything unsaid, everything forbidden. Gabriella's gaze dropped to his mouth, then back to his eyes. She wanted him. God, she wanted him more than she had ever wanted anything. But she wouldn't beg. She wouldn't break herself against walls he refused to lower. Not tonight. Not yet. Slowly, gently, she withdrew her hand. Matthew's fingers tightened instinctively before letting go, as if his body betrayed the fear his mind still clung to. Gabriella stepped back, creating space, even though it tore at her. "When you're ready," she said softly. "When you're brave enough to let yourself feel something, I'll be here." Matthew didn't move, didn't speak. Gabriella turned and walked toward her bedroom, the sound of the rain swallowing the silence between them. At the door, she hesitated, her hand on the frame. She didn't look back. If he wanted more, if he wanted her, he would have to choose it. The choice had to be his. Only when she closed the door behind her did she let the tears fall. They weren't tears of regret. They were the tears of a woman who had finally learned that real strength wasn't holding on. It was knowing when to let go, and trusting that if it was real, it would find its way back. Gabriella sat curled up in the window seat of her room, a forgotten book resting on her lap, her gaze lost in the drizzle that softened the Savannah skyline. The storm from the night before had passed, but it had left behind a chill she couldn't shake. She hadn't seen Matthew all morning. Not at breakfast, not in his office, not pacing the halls like he sometimes did when he thought no one was watching. The emptiness gnawed at her, a hollow ache that made breathing feel like work. She told herself she wasn't waiting for him. But when the soft knock came at her door, her heart still leapt. She opened it to find Celia standing there, perfectly composed, a leather folder clutched in her hands. "Good morning, Mrs. Sinclair," Celia said with a small, polite smile. "Mr. Sinclair asked me to deliver these." Gabriella blinked, pulling the door wider to accept the folder. "What is it?" Celia's expression softened. Just a little. Something he thought you might like to see. Before Gabriella could ask more, Celia gave a slight nod and turned away, her heels clicking down the hall. Gabriella closed the door and sat back down, opening the folder with trembling fingers. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. At first, she didn't understand. The first image showed a dilapidated community center she vaguely recognized from news reports, a place that had once been the heart of one of Savannah's poorest neighborhoods, now abandoned and crumbling. The next photo showed the same building but restored, fresh paint, clean lines, vibrant murals on the walls. Children played in the courtyard, laughter captured midair. Gabriella flipped through the photos faster now, her heart thudding. Each one showed something different: a scholarship ceremony for underprivileged students, a free health clinic, a new library wing named after Matthew's late mother. None of it bore his name, no plaques, no press releases. Just quiet, unseen acts of restoration and hope. She found a handwritten note tucked in the back, the ink sharp and precise, the words few but devastating. Not everything I build is made of stone. M. Gabriella pressed the note against her chest, her throat burning. For so long, she had seen only the walls he built around himself. She hadn't realized he had been building bridges too, silent, invisible, waiting for someone brave enough to walk across them. She needed to find him. Gabriella slipped into a simple dress, threw on a coat, and made her way through the house, her footsteps sure and quick. She found Matthew outside, standing at the edge of the estate's private gardens. The wind tugged at his sleeves, ruffling his hair. He didn't hear her approach. She took a breath, steeling herself, then spoke. "I saw what you built." Matthew stiffened but didn't turn. "I wasn't hiding it," he said quietly. "I just didn't think it mattered." Gabriella moved closer, until they stood shoulder to shoulder, both staring out at the endless sweep of roses and ivy. "It matters," she said, her voice breaking. "It matters more than you know." He turned then, slowly, the guarded lines of his face etched deep. "I'm not the man you think you want," he said, his voice low and raw. "I'll disappoint you, hurt you." "You already have," Gabriella said, her smile trembling. "But you're also the man who saves things. Who saves people." Matthew closed his eyes, a muscle ticking in his jaw. "I don't know how to be what you need," he said. Gabriella reached out, her fingers finding his, weaving through them with deliberate slowness. "You don't have to be perfect," she whispered. "You just have to be real." For a long, breathless moment, he didn't move. Then, finally, Matthew squeezed her hand back, a quiet surrender, fragile and beautiful. The air between them shifted, warmer now, filled with a tentative hope. "I don't deserve you," he said, voice rough. Gabriella lifted his hand to her heart, pressing it there, letting him feel the wild, desperate beat of it. "Let me decide that," she said. Matthew's eyes searched hers, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw the man he tried so hard to bury, the boy who had once believed in love, in family, in something bigger than survival. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. When their lips finally met, it wasn't fireworks or firestorms. It was something quieter, deeper, a promise whispered into the spaces where their broken pieces fit together. Gabriella melted into him, her hand sliding up to frame his jaw, feeling the tremble he couldn't hide. Matthew pulled her closer, one hand splayed against her back, the other threading into her hair, grounding himself in her as if he feared she might vanish. When they broke apart, breathless and trembling, Gabriella pressed her forehead against his. "We're going to make a mess of this, aren't we?" she whispered, half laughing, half crying. Matthew's breath was a shaky exhale against her skin. "Probably." She smiled, pulling him closer still. "Good," she said. "Life's better messy anyway." They stood there in the gardens, rain starting to fall again in soft, misty sheets, the world blurring around them. But for the first time, Gabriella didn't feel lost. She felt found. The morning sun slanted through the tall windows, gilding everything in a soft, golden light. Gabriella sat at the kitchen island, stirring her coffee absently, still trying to ground herself after the night before. The memory of Matthew's kiss lingered on her lips, tender and tentative, like a secret whispered in the dark. For the first time since stepping into this gilded cage, she hadn't felt trapped. She had felt chosen. A soft shuffle behind her made her glance over her shoulder. Matthew stood there, barefoot, hair slightly tousled, sleeves of his white shirt rolled to his elbows. For a man who seemed allergic to vulnerability, he looked disarmingly real right now. Human. He cleared his throat, almost shyly. "I didn't expect you to be up this early," he said, moving toward the coffee maker. Gabriella smiled faintly. "I could say the same about you." He poured himself a cup, leaning against the counter across from her, the distance between them smaller than it had ever been, and somehow more loaded. "I have a proposal," Matthew said, setting down his cup. Gabriella arched an eyebrow. "Another contract?" This time he actually smiled, small and self-deprecating. "No contracts." He hesitated, glancing down, then back up. "A truce." "At least for today." "A truce?" she repeated, amused. "A day without obligations, no galas, no press, no negotiations." He shrugged one shoulder. "Just us." Gabriella's heart twisted at the vulnerability hidden beneath his careful nonchalance. "And what exactly would just us do?" she asked softly. Matthew smiled again, and this time it reached his eyes. "You'll see." An hour later, they stood outside the estate, the warm spring air carrying the scent of jasmine and river salt. A black SUV idled at the curb, Celia waiting patiently beside it with an amused glint in her eyes. Gabriella looked at Matthew suspiciously. "Are you kidnapping me?" "No violence," he said lightly, holding the door open for her. "Promise." As they drove, Gabriella tried to guess their destination, but Matthew remained maddeningly silent, only glancing at her now and then with a secretive smile. When the SUV finally pulled to a stop, Gabriella blinked in surprise. It was a farmer's market, sprawling, colorful, chaotic. Booths lined with fresh flowers, handmade crafts, local produce, children laughing, vendors calling out prices. Gabriella turned to Matthew, stunned. "You come here?" He looked almost sheepish. "I used to, before everything got complicated." Something inside her softened even more. "Lead the way, Mr. Sinclair," she teased. He offered his arm, and after only a brief hesitation, she slipped her hand through. They wandered the stalls, Matthew surprisingly at ease, even charming, as he bantered with the vendors. Gabriella caught glimpses of a man who had once lived simply, before ambition had walled him off from the world. At one booth, she spotted a small potted plant with delicate pink flowers. "It's beautiful," she murmured, leaning closer. "Pick one," Matthew said quietly at her side. She laughed. "I don't think you can just buy a living thing like picking out a necktie." "Maybe not," he said, watching her with an unreadable expression. But you can choose something you want, something just for you. Gabriella hesitated, her fingers brushing the soft petals. No one had asked her what she wanted in a long time. She chose a tiny magnolia tree, its white blossoms just beginning to open. Matthew paid the vendor without blinking, handing the pot to Gabriella with a care that made her chest ache. They strolled through the market until their arms were full of flowers, pastries, little trinkets Gabriella couldn't resist. They stopped by a food truck for sandwiches, sitting on a worn picnic bench under a shady oak. For a while, they didn't talk. They just existed, together. No expectations. No walls. Gabriella watched Matthew as he laughed at a child's clumsy attempt to chase a butterfly. The sound so rare it felt almost sacred. "You're different here," she said quietly. Matthew looked at her, all pretense stripped away. "So are you." Gabriella smiled, her heart thudding painfully. "Maybe this is who we really are," she whispered. "Maybe," he agreed, voice rough around the edges. They finished their lunch in companionable silence, the warm breeze tangling through Gabriella's hair. She turned her face up to the sky, closing her eyes, letting herself believe, if only for a moment, that happiness didn't have to be a mirage. On the way back to the estate, Matthew's hand brushed hers on the seat between them. He didn't move away. Neither did she. Later, as Gabriella placed the tiny magnolia tree on the sunroom windowsill, Matthew watched her from the doorway, hands tucked into his pockets. "You should name it," he said. She turned, surprised. "The tree?" He nodded, a small, almost bashful smile playing at his lips. Gabriella thought for a moment, then said, "Hope." Matthew's smile faded into something deeper, something that wrapped around her heart and squeezed. "I like that," he said hoarsely. Gabriella crossed the room to him, stopping just shy of touching. "Thank you," she said, voice thick with everything she couldn't put into words. "For what?" he asked, bewildered. "For today, for trying." Matthew reached out then, slow and tentative, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'll keep trying," he said, so quietly she barely heard it. Gabriella closed her eyes against the wave of emotion that crashed over her. This wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't neat or easy. But maybe the best kind of love wasn't the one you stumbled into. Maybe it was the kind you chose to fight for, every single day. The sun dipped low over the savannah skyline, bleeding gold and crimson into the evening sky. Gabriella sat curled up in the sunroom, her fingers absently stroking the tender leaves of her little magnolia tree. Hope. That's what she had named it. What she had dared to let herself believe in. She heard the distant sound of the front door opening, the low rumble of Matthew's voice as he spoke to Celia. Something about the tone snagged her attention, a tightness she hadn't heard in days. She rose, smoothing her skirt, heart skipping with a strange sense of foreboding as she made her way through the quiet halls. Matthew stood in his office, back to her, shoulders tense. Papers were scattered across his desk in precise disarray, and in his hand, he held a slim envelope. Gabriella knocked lightly against the doorframe. Matthew stiffened, but didn't turn. "Is everything all right?" she asked carefully. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then slowly, he set the envelope down and faced her. "Gabriella," he said, his voice low, almost hoarse, "I need to show you something." A hollow pit opened in her stomach. She crossed the room on unsteady feet, every step weighed down with a gathering dread. Matthew picked up the envelope, holding it between them like a fragile thing. "These were prepared before we married," he said. "As a A precaution? Gabriella frowned, her pulse quickening. What is it? He offered it to her without a word. Hands trembling, Gabriella opened the envelope, slid out the documents. She scanned the heading, and her heart slammed against her ribs so hard it hurt. Divorce agreement. Her throat closed up. The words blurred through a sudden rush of hot, disbelieving tears. You had divorce papers drawn up before we even said I do, she whispered. Matthew's jaw clenched. It was business, a safeguard. Gabriella staggered back a step, the folder slipping from her fingers, scattering papers like falling leaves. And all this time, she said, her voice cracking, you knew you had an exit ready, an escape. It's not like that, Matthew said sharply, stepping toward her. It was before. I didn't know. Didn't know what? She choked out. That I might actually matter? Pain flickered across his face, raw and unfiltered. You do matter, he said, the words torn from him. Gabriella shook her head, backing away. How can I believe anything you say? She whispered. When you planned for the moment you decided I wasn't worth it? Matthew reached for her, but she flinched before he could touch her. The rejection hit him like a slap. I never planned to leave you, he said fiercely. Not after... After what? She demanded, tears spilling freely now. After I became convenient? After I made you look good? No! His voice cracked, rough with desperation. After you became the only thing that made this place feel like a home. Silence. Thick. Crushing. Gabriella's chest heaved with the force of holding in the scream, clawing its way up her throat. I can't do this, she said, her voice a whisper of ruin. I can't be your convenience, your insurance policy. She turned blindly, stumbling toward the door. Gabriella, please, Matthew called after her, his voice breaking. But she didn't stop. Couldn't. She fled up the stairs, down the familiar hall, into the sanctuary of her room. Slamming the door shut, she pressed her back against it, sliding to the floor as sobs tore from her. The house was too big, too empty, the walls pressing in on her. How stupid she had been. How hopelessly foolish to believe that a man who built walls higher than any fortress could be the one to let her in. Gabriella curled into herself on the cold hardwood, wrapping her arms around her knees as the storm inside her raged. Downstairs, she thought she heard footsteps pacing. A door opening, then nothing, silence swallowing everything whole. Hours passed. Maybe longer. When she finally lifted her head, the sky outside had turned black, the only light a pale sliver of moon cutting through the storm clouds. She rose unsteadily, moving to the window. There, on the windowsill, sat the tiny magnolia tree. Hope. Gabriella traced the soft petals with shaking fingers. What was hope, really? Something you planted, nurtured, believed in, even when everything around you told you it would never survive. Her heart twisted painfully. She had a choice now, to leave. To cut her losses and protect what pieces of herself she had left, or to stay, to fight. Not for a marriage born out of contracts and necessity, but for something real, something messy, something terrifying. Tears blurred her vision again. Hope, she realized, wasn't about guarantees. It was about choosing to believe anyway. Gabriella straightened, her hand steady now as she set the magnolia back into the light. Somewhere deep inside the house, she thought she heard a door close, the low hum of a car engine starting. Her heart lurched. Without thinking, she grabbed a sweater, pulling it tight around her as she ran through the empty halls, down the grand staircase, out into the night. Rain misted the air, cool against her flushed cheeks. The driveway was empty. Matthew was gone. Gabriella stood there, barefoot on the cold stone, the wind tearing at her hair. He had left, but she wasn't broken. Not this time. Because hope didn't live in grand gestures. It lived in the quiet, stubborn refusal to give up. And she wasn't giving up. Not on herself. Not on them. Not yet. Gabriella paced the empty living room, her bare feet silent against the cold marble floor. The rain had stopped, but the storm inside her hadn't. Every sound, the creak of the old oak beams, the ticking of the grandfather clock, felt louder now in the vacuum Matthew had left behind. She wrapped her arms around herself, standing in the middle of the cavernous room that suddenly seemed too big, too hollow. Where had he gone? Why had he left? And worse, why had part of her still hoped he would stay and fight? Gabriella squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to breathe past the tightness in her chest. She couldn't sit here waiting for answers that might never come. Not tonight. Not ever. The house felt haunted by his absence. Every room a cruel echo of what they could have been. What they might still be, if either of them dared. The sound of wheels crunching against wet gravel jolted her upright. She rushed to the window, heart slamming against her ribs. Headlights sliced through the darkness, cutting across the front lawn. Her breath caught. The car door opened, and Matthew stepped out, his figure illuminated by the golden wash of the porch lights. For a moment, he simply stood there, rain clinging to his hair, his shoulders taut with uncertainty. Then he moved, striding toward the front door with the kind of determination that left no room for doubt. Gabriella stayed frozen where she was, every part of her trembling. The front door swung open. He stood there breathing hard, rain dripping from the collar of his shirt. "I didn't leave," Matthew said hoarsely, as if he had to force the words out. "Not really. I couldn't." Gabriella swallowed hard, her throat burning. "You drove away," she whispered. "I needed time to think," he said, stepping inside, the door falling shut behind him. "I needed to stop reacting and start deciding." She shook her head, backing away a step. "Matthew." He crossed the space between them in 2 strides, his hands reaching for hers, but stopping just short, hovering as if afraid he might break her with the touch. "I was a coward," he said, his voice shaking. "I thought if I kept everything controlled, everything planned, I wouldn't lose anything again." Gabriella blinked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But I was wrong," he continued, his gaze burning into hers, "because I was losing you." A choked sob escaped her, and this time, when he reached for her, she didn't pull away. Matthew cradled her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I don't want a marriage built on contracts and fear," he said, voice thick with emotion. "I want you, all of you. Your laughter, your anger, your stubbornness, your hope." She let out a shaky laugh, the sound wet and broken. "Hope," she whispered. He nodded, pressing his forehead to hers. "I thought I'd built my world out of stone," he said. "But then you came in, with your smile, your courage, and you planted something I never thought would grow here." Gabriella's hands clutched at the fabric of his soaked shirt, grounding herself in the reality of him. "I love you," he said, the words raw, stripped bare. "Not because it's convenient, not because it makes sense. I love you because you're the only thing in my life that ever has." For a long, aching moment, she just stood there, letting the truth of it settle into every broken corner of her heart. Then she rose onto her toes and kissed him. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't hesitant. It was everything. Anger, forgiveness, longing, love, wrapped into one desperate, breathtaking kiss. Matthew's arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him, as if he never intended to let go again. Gabriella clung to him, feeling the cracks in both of them splinter and heal with every heartbeat. When they finally broke apart, Matthew cupped her face, brushing a damp strand of hair from her cheek. "I know I don't deserve you," he whispered. Gabriella smiled through her tears, her hands framing his jaw. "Maybe not," she teased, her voice trembling. "But lucky for you, I'm stubborn." He laughed, a real ragged, beautiful sound, and kissed her again, slower this time, savoring it. They stood there in the empty living room, two broken people who had finally stopped running from each other. Hope, Gabriella thought, wasn't a promise. It was a choice, and tonight they were both choosing it. Together. The first real morning of them felt almost unreal. Gabriella sat curled on the kitchen counter, barefoot, a mug of coffee warming her hands. Matthew stood across from her, sleeves rolled up, fumbling terribly as he tried to crack an egg without destroying it. She bit back a laugh, watching the hard, focused set of his jaw as he battled breakfast. "You're scowling at it like it's a hostile takeover," she said, amusement dancing in her voice. Matthew shot her a mock glare over his shoulder. "This is considerably harder. Eggs don't negotiate." Gabriella shook her head, smiling so wide it made her cheeks ache. She hadn't realized how much she had missed this. Small moments. Normal moments. A man who tried, even when he wasn't perfect at it. The eggs were a disaster. Somehow half raw and half burned. But Matthew presented them with a triumphant flourish, like he'd just prepared a 5-star meal. Gabriella accepted her plate solemnly, biting her lip. "I take no responsibility if I end up in the hospital," she teased. "I'll have Celia on standby," he said dryly, but there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A softness he no longer tried so hard to hide. They ate together at the kitchen island, bumping knees under the counter, exchanging smiles that said more than words could. It wasn't perfect. It was better. Later that afternoon, Matthew disappeared into his office for a few hours to handle calls. Gabriella wandered the estate aimlessly, feeling lighter than she had in months. Her feet carried her to the West Wing again, the gallery of family photos where she had first glimpsed the cracks in Matthew's armor. This time she didn't hesitate. She studied the old photographs. Matthew's boyish grin, his parents' stiff posture, a rare candid shot of a younger Matthew and Mrs. Beatrice Sinclair laughing together in a garden. Gabriella smiled softly. There had always been pieces of this man hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to see them. The sound of footsteps made her turn. Matthew stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching her with a curious, guarded expression. "You're not running away this time," he said. "No," she said, lifting her chin. "I'm not." He walked toward her slowly, each step measured, as if giving her the chance to change her mind. When he reached her, he looked at the photos too, silent for a long moment. "My mother used to bring me here when I was a kid," he said. "She said the best way to remember who you are is to remember where you came from." Gabriella listened, her heart breaking for the boy who had lost so much too soon. "I think she'd be proud of the man you've become," she said softly. Matthew's throat worked. He reached out, brushing his fingers over a frame. "She believed in second chances," he murmured. "Even when no one else did." Gabriella stepped closer, sliding her hand into his. "You deserve yours too," she whispered. He turned to her then, his gaze raw and open. "I don't want second chances with anyone else," he said. "Only you." Tears stung her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I'm right here," she said, squeezing his hand. I'm not going anywhere. Matthew exhaled shakily, as if releasing years of tightly held breath. Then he pulled something from his pocket, a small, velvet box. Gabriella's heart stumbled. I know we got married for all the wrong reasons, he said, voice rough with emotion. But I want a real beginning with you. No contracts. No conditions. Just us. He opened the box, revealing a simple, breathtaking diamond ring. A true promise. Gabriella's hand flew to her mouth, her heart slamming wildly in her chest. Matthew dropped to one knee, not because society demanded it, not because it was expected, but because he wanted her to see him. Vulnerable. Hopeful. Gabriella Whitmore, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion flooding his eyes. Will you marry me? Truly. Completely. This time, for real. Tears spilled down Gabriella's cheeks, but her smile was so wide, it hurt. Yes, she whispered, choking on a laugh sob. Yes, Matthew. 1,000 times yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, standing to gather her into his arms. Their lips met, sweet, sure, sealing a promise they had both fought like hell to deserve. This wasn't the ending, it was their real beginning. And for the first time, Gabriella knew with absolute certainty they weren't just surviving anymore. They were finally, truly living together. The air inside Sinclair Innovations buzzed with an uneasy energy Gabriella couldn't ignore. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows in Matthew's office, watching the city move below, feeling the storm gather, even though the sky was clear. Behind her, Matthew paced, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and clipped. No, that's not acceptable, he said sharply. We renegotiated those terms weeks ago. Tell them if they breach, the deal's dead. He ended the call with a terse swipe, his hand raking through his hair as he turned toward her. Trouble? She asked gently. Matthew exhaled, tension radiating off him in waves. Landon Carr. Gabriella stiffened. Of course. I thought he'd backed off, she said, crossing the room to him. He hasn't, Matthew said grimly. He's been quietly buying influence, sowing doubt among some of the board members. Whisper campaigns, undermining the merger. Gabriella felt a chill thread through her spine. Can he block it? If he flips enough votes at the shareholders' meeting next month, Matthew said, voice tight, he can do a lot worse than that. She reached for his hand without thinking, lacing her fingers through his. You won't let him, she said firmly. You never lose. Matthew looked down at their joined hands, his jaw tight. I don't care about the company, he said suddenly, voice rough. Not the way I used to. Not if it means losing you. Gabriella's heart twisted. You won't lose me, she whispered. But you have to fight for what matters to you, Matthew. You have to stand for the things you've built, not because you're afraid to lose them, but because they deserve to survive. He stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his eyes. Resolve. Not cold, ruthless control. Purpose. You're right, he said quietly. This merger isn't just about business. It's about the people depending on it, the communities we've invested in, the programs we've started. Gabriella squeezed his hand. Then don't let someone like Landon tear it down. Matthew nodded, his shoulders straightening, the man she loved stepping fully into himself. The next week was a blur of preparation. Gabriella watched as Matthew met with advisors, strategized with his legal team, made calls to shareholders. She attended charity luncheons, shaking hands, building bridges, subtly reinforcing the image of Sinclair Innovations as a company tied to heart as much as power. And everywhere they went, they were a team. No longer pretending, no longer hiding. The night before the shareholders' meeting, Gabriella found Matthew standing on the balcony outside their bedroom, staring out over the darkened city. She stepped up beside him, slipping her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against his back. "You're ready," she said softly. "I'm ready," he agreed, turning to pull her against him fully. They stood there in the cool night air, hearts beating in quiet rhythm, the silence between them filled with everything they didn't need to say. The next morning, Gabriella sat in the front row of the glass-walled conference room, her hands folded tightly in her lap as Matthew stepped up to the podium. The room was packed, shareholders, board members, executives, and at the back, leaning casually against the wall, Landon Carr watched with a smirk Gabriella longed to wipe off his face. Matthew began speaking, and the room shifted. He didn't lecture, he didn't threaten, he told a story. Of his parents, of the dreams that built Sinclair Innovations not just as a company, but as a legacy of hope. Of every community center rebuilt, every scholarship awarded, every small hand reached out and lifted up. He spoke of responsibility, of heart, of believing in something bigger than profit margins. And when he finished, the room didn't erupt into applause. It held a breathless, reverent silence. Gabriella's heart ached with pride. Votes were cast, tallied. When the results were announced, Matthew didn't react outwardly. But Gabriella saw the way his shoulders eased, the faint tremble in his hand as he set down the microphone. The merger was secured. Sinclair Innovations was safe. Landon Carr slipped from the room like a shadow defeated by the sunrise. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the champagne had been poured, Matthew found Gabriella in a quiet corner of the terrace. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms. "You saved me," he murmured against her hair. Gabriella leaned into him, closing her eyes. "No," she whispered back. "You saved yourself. I just reminded you you could." He pulled back, framing her face with his hands. "Marry me," he said suddenly, urgently. "For real this time. No contracts, no conditions." "No pretending." Gabriella laughed, her eyes shining with tears. "I already said yes," she reminded him. He smiled, wide, real, devastating. "Then let's start planning," he said, "because I'm not waiting another second to make you truly mine." She rose onto her toes, kissing him fiercely. And this time, there was no hesitation. No fear. Only two hearts, finally free, choosing each other again, and forever. The sun broke over the river, spilling light across the Sinclair estate like a quiet blessing. Gabriella stood before the mirror, smoothing the simple white satin of her gown. Her heart raced, but it wasn't fear this time. It was certainty. The door creaked open, and Sophie stepped in, clutching a small bouquet of magnolias. Her eyes shone with tears she didn't bother to hide. "You're beautiful," she whispered. Gabriella laughed softly, turning to face her best friend. "You're just saying that because you picked the flowers." Sophie sniffled dramatically. "Maybe. But it's still true." They hugged tightly, and for a moment Gabriella let herself lean into the comfort of a friendship that had seen her through the worst and the best. "Ready?" Sophie asked as she pulled back. Gabriella glanced at her reflection one more time. The woman staring back at her wasn't the same girl who had stood in a courthouse signing a contract to save her father. She was stronger now, braver, and she was about to marry the man who had taught her that even the most broken hearts could choose love again. "I've never been more ready," she said. Outside, the estate gardens had been transformed. White chairs lined the green lawn, petals scattered across the aisle. Spanish moss hung from the ancient oaks, swaying gently in the spring breeze. Close friends, business partners, and family filled the seats, faces bright with joy. Matthew stood at the altar, waiting. He wore a crisp navy suit, no tie, his hair slightly mussed as if he'd been running a nervous hand through it. But when he looked up and saw her, every line of tension in his body melted away. Gabriella's breath caught. It wasn't nerves that made her steps falter. It was the overwhelming swell of emotion she had no hope of containing. Beatrice Sinclair, regal and smiling in the front row, gave her a small, proud nod. Gabriella smiled back through the tears gathering in her eyes. Matthew met her halfway down the aisle, his hands reaching for hers without hesitation. "You came," he whispered, his voice thick. Gabriella laughed shakily. "I think I'd have tackled you if you tried to run this time." The guests chuckled warmly, the intimacy of the moment wrapping around them all like a soft cloak. The officiant cleared his throat, and the ceremony began, but Gabriella barely heard a word. All she could see was Matthew. All she could feel was the certainty humming through her chest. When it came time for vows, Matthew didn't reach for a card or a prepared speech. He simply held her hands, looking into her eyes like there was no one else in the world. "You taught me," he said, voice rough with emotion, "that love isn't a weakness. It's the bravest thing I'll ever choose." Gabriella's vision blurred completely now, tears spilling down her cheeks unchecked. "I choose you," Matthew said. "Today, tomorrow, every day for the rest of my life." A soft gasp came from the crowd, the emotional weight of his words rippling through them like a heartbeat. Gabriella tried to speak, but her throat tightened. She took a shaky breath, squeezing his hands. "I came into this marriage to save someone I loved," she said, her voice trembling. "But somewhere along the way, you saved me." She smiled through her tears, a radiant, trembling smile. "You showed me that love isn't about being perfect," she continued. "It's about choosing each other, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." She paused, her thumb brushing over the back of his hand. "I choose you, Matthew Sinclair," she whispered. "Always." The officiant declared them husband and wife, but Gabriella didn't wait. She surged forward, cupping Matthew's face in her hands, kissing him with everything she had, every fear, every hope, every piece of her heart stitched into that one breathless moment. The guests erupted into cheers and applause, but Gabriella barely heard them. All she knew was the feel of Matthew's arms around her, the steady beat of his heart against hers. Later, after the champagne had been poured and the laughter echoed across the gardens, Gabriella slipped away from the crowd, her bare feet brushing the soft grass. She found Matthew by the magnolia tree they had planted together, the tiny sapling now staked proudly upright, small but stubborn against the vastness of the estate grounds. He turned at the sound of her approach, his smile lighting up the twilight. Gabriella crossed to him, slipping her hand into his. They stood there silently for a long time, watching the breeze stir the tender white blossoms. "You know," Matthew said, his voice low, "I used to think everything I built was about legacy." "Power." Gabriella rested her head against his shoulder. "And now?" she asked. He kissed the top of her head, his voice a whisper against her hair. "Now I know the only thing worth building is a life with you." Tears burned her eyes again, but she didn't fight them. Some things were meant to be felt fully. They stayed there until the stars blinked into the velvet sky. Two souls who had once been broken, now stitched together by hope, by choice, by love. Not a perfect story, but a real one. And that, Gabriella thought as Matthew tightened his arms around her, was the only kind that ever truly mattered. If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thought matter to me either way.